All right, you're welcome, everyone. To kick off 2025, we brought back a legend, one of our favorites, a director that you know and love, that we certainly have a ton of respect for, Mr. Bruce Pittman. Bruce, how are you?
Well, I'm fine. And how are you doing today?
Good, man. We survived the fires, we survived the holidays, we survived all our work for the Children's Hospital. Now it's time to survive a conversation between the two of us on a director. Well, actually, it's a director we have a lot of respect for. One, I met him, but you, I think, knew him a lot better than I did. My wife worked with him. The man behind everything, well, some of my favorite films, The Haunting, worked with Orson Welles on Citizen Kane as an editor and gave us everything from Haunting to Sound of Music to Star Trek The Motion Picture, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Mr. Robert Wise.
Yes, indeed. I think he was a wonderful man. I met him more than a few times and was always very gracious, very kind. The first time I met him was when I was very young, my first trip to Los Angeles. I was went to Universal and wanted to interview
Yeah.
as many people as I could while I was down there, and Robert Wise graciously sat down for an inordinate amount of time while I talked to him about his career and several of his films. And he was very, very nice to me. And all the way up through the 70s and 80s, I would occasionally bump into him and interview him. And I was on the set of Audrey Rose, where we filmed some interviews while he was doing that. And I've got a lot of respect for him because he's one of the unsung directors. He's never considered in the top echelon of great directors, and I think he should be there just for the span of time he worked, what he worked on, and the various genres that he worked in. I mean, he did a little bit of everything and did them very well.
Well, you and I will do a case report on one director after another that deserves better attention than they get sometimes. Wise was definitely well known. You're right. He's not like, for me, he's in the pantheon of great directors. I loved his approach to The Haunting, and I admired a lot of what he did. And he was exactly like you say. He was very gracious. I could call him when I started out at Warner Brothers. Those were the days you could call the DGA, ask for a director's contact info, and get it.
Right.
And usually it was a business manager or an agent or an entertainment attorney. But if your request was legitimate, they'd put word in and you'd get a call back. And more often or not, and Wise was one of the guys that called back. And maybe he was like this with you. I want to get to your favorite movie of his in a second, but he acted like he had never been complimented before when I said he was one of my favorite directors. He was like, wow, that's so nice of you to tell me. I'm like, come on. Come on. But wasn't he like he was very like endearing like that, wasn't he?
Yeah, self-effacing. I mean, he came right out of the studio system. He was in that
Yeah.
transition period, then he became independent, but uh he was just I'm a director, I've got a job to do. I go to work and I do it. I mean, there was
Right.
nothing special or spectacular about it. And he just said, well, this is a story I like to tell. And so I went in and we did it. It was that
Now,
kind of.
for sure. What do you have a favorite movie of his or a couple of favorites?
Yeah, I sort of did up a list, and we can go through it quickly because he directed 42 films, so I'm just picking out a few. But
Yeah, yeah. He was busy.
one that I really like, and just because I recognize being a director, the difficulties in making it and how he pulled it off was the Sand Pebbles.
All right, there's the boom. About a dozen junks, 50 to 60 feet apart. A cable from bow to bow. Half speed.
Half speed.
Looks like sampans are bringing more men from shore. Drop the armor flaps. Call general quarters.
All hands to general quarters. Man your battle station. Let's go. Look alive.
Minimum crew in the engine spaces. All of us come topside.
Aye, aye, sir. Minimum crew in the engine spaces. All others topside. All others topside.
Coming up. Stosky, take the throttle. Colonel McDonald, handle the boilers. Rest of you on deck.
What's it?
Holman, set up a BAR position forward. You others lend a hand.
Aye, aye, sir.
I'll get it.
From the bulkhead over.
Battle station's manned and ready, Captain.
Very well. Run up the battle flag.
Aye, aye, sir. Battle flag!
Full speed.
Full speed. Holman, you and your men lower the jackstaff.
Let's go.
Superb film. Certainly one of Steve McQueen's best performances. And just the scope of it and some of the scenes in that, the direction of them is just amazing. You sit there and go like, how long and how just the difficulties of doing the scene is just amazing. There's a scene in there where the American gunboat is going upriver to save some people in a mission, and they've got to get past the Chinese communists have barricaded the river.
Yeah.
And that whole sequence is amazing. It's almost done time for time, and you see every detail of it, and it's just superbly done. And when you're working on water, is the worst place to put a camera and trying to direct when you're on water and you've got boats. And just imagine, oh God, that take didn't work. We've got to reset. You got to take the boat all the way back to where it was. It's just an amazing piece of work. But in terms of just the drama of it, it was amazing. And I think it was secretly the first film about Vietnam that was done, because it was about Americans being in China and what the hell were they doing in China. And I don't know whether he would have said that. He said, no, it was just a damn good book and a good story. It had nothing to do with Vietnam, but it came out in 1966 when the protests were just getting started, and about, Americans going into a foreign country where they shouldn't have been in the first place. And, so in the audience, I was sort of seeing it as that. And when I watch it now, I still see it as that. But I like that film a lot.
He'd be the first one to tell you it's open to interpretation, probably knowing full well he was insinuating certain things or doing some directorial foreshadowing. What I love about the movie you picked is the action sequences are spectacular, and so is the buildup. The scene you're talking about right there, there's that moment where they're prepping the guns and they're doing everything the characters do.
Yeah.
He cast great faces in that too. Joe Turkel, Simon Oakland, really wonderful actors. But there's that moment where the flag gets hoisted up and there's like that galvanizing music cue and they're all, okay, now we're doing this. And just the way the camera moves to capture McQueen moving along the sandbags and the bullets hitting he was underappreciated, I think, in terms of his action sequences.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
and that's a great example. That's like I've heard people have their various critiques, the movie's too long or whatever, but there are moments in that movie that you can't deny that are spectacular.
And the movie, although it's long, the story builds beautifully, and
Right.
the ending is I think one of the best I've seen. It's and I don't mind its length because when they made movies like that, there was a certain pace, and he got into it,
Yeah.
and he maintained that pace and built and built and built, and you really got into the characters in that film.
Yeah, you
Uh,
did. You got into him for sure. I mean, that's definitely a movie that you can't help but that's definitely a movie you can't help but fully appreciate. I mean, the other movie that we didn't mention, but I think is really interesting was Two Flags West.
all
So
right,
I
right.
swear I get a lot of flack for saying this, but I swear that's a blueprint for Major Dundee, the Peck and Paw film. And people love to argue, and we'll skip over it because you haven't had a chance to watch it lately. But I will say it even has not only the same story points of Union soldiers recruiting rebel prisoners to fight renegade Native Americans, but they also leave the base singing the Dixie song in both movies. You can't
No.
tell me that, but it's one of those things where Wise directs tension really well
Mhm.
between and what decision will the rebel commander make versus the Union commander. But obviously, after the Sand Pebbles, in terms of some of his more interesting movies. I mean, this guy did everything from like ghost stories to musicals.
Yeah, you go from The Day the Earth Stood Still, Star Trek, Sound of Music, Sand Pebbles, I Want to Live. I mean, he really covered every genre there is,
Yeah.
and all of them are like within that genre, excellent films, among the best. And The Haunting among horror films, a lot of people hold that one up as being, on the level of The Shining.
God, it knows I'm here.
Look, I know the supernatural is something that isn't supposed to happen, but it does happen.
Now look, Doc, we're buddies, okay? But don't try to convert me.
I'm trying to prepare you. My name's Marquay, Dr. Marquay, a scientist interested in the supernatural. The unnatural, if you like. I came to Hill House to find the key to another world. Assisting me in this exploration of the unknown was Eleanor, Nell, who could look back into the past, and Theo, something of a witch who could see into the future. This is Luke, who didn't believe in anything, until evil, patient and waiting, made him change his mind.
Stop it! God. God. Whose hand was I holding?
How many of us take seriously the things we cannot or do not want to understand, simply because we are afraid?
No, you're Paul! Did you hear me calling?
Oh, this house. You have to watch it every minute.
The Haunting was produced and directed by Robert Wise, brilliant producer of West Side Story. The stars consist of a cross-section of top talent in the world of entertainment. Julie Harris, Claire Bloom, Richard Johnson, Russ Tamblyn.
What does it take to convince you that the dead do not always rest in peace? That some houses, like Hill House, are born bad?
Well, I think The Hauntings, I mean, first of all, I found out recently from Disney legend Kirk Hansen that that was the inspiration for the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. Walt Disney sent all his wed people out to see The Haunting. And now when you go through the Haunted Mansion, you know what I'm talking about, where the walls push out and stuff.
Yeah.
But we had Richard Johnson on this program several times before he passed away. He did probably 100 movies, but man, did it always came back to The Haunting with him. We always asked him about The Haunting, haunting this, haunting that. And I think what's unique is the movie had such an impact on us, right, Bruce? But you know, you think for those guys, it's 6 actors in a house.
Yeah.
You know, it's 6 actors.
I think
or 4
when he
actors in a
talks
house.
about it, because of the ease of the production, they're on a movie set, they go into work, same spot every day, and they just work their way through it. And they would just, you know, add stuff. I mean, with the door that you know, pulses.
Right.
They had a lot of fun with that. They said, well, let's work on that a little more. What can we do to make this door work? And I think they came back to it a couple of times and said, wow, that's really great. So I think they had a lot of fun and like, okay, let's try something out here where they would have the time to do it because, I mean, the story's very simple. These people gather in a haunted house. That's the movie.
Right. You're a renowned director, prone to throw some tricks into the action to make people think one thing or another. Like there's moments where they were like, they're like in the greenhouse and the actress Claire Bloom says she moved or something. And then they leave the scene by pulling in on that statue. Do you think at any time that they were doing that, they go, this isn't going to work, Robert. This is not going to scare anyone. Or did you think they knew it was going to be such an effective movie?
I think they probably had a pretty good guess at it. I remember when I did my one and only horror film, I did enjoy going to the theater where it was playing, and I sat in the aisle across from a solitary guy that was in there watching the movie. And I knew when something was going to, you know, did it work or not work? And he had his popcorn. And of course, just before the scare moment, I would just watch him. And sure enough, the popcorn did come up out of his cup. So I thought, oh, that worked. And a couple of others, I thought that would have worked better. And then I hear later on stuff that scared people I didn't even think was scary at all. But you never know. You take a good guess at it, and there are certain things you could do, you know, like somebody jumping into a close-up and, you know, that kind of.
Right.
But,
well, there's, I mean, The Hauntings on Turner Classic Movies annually at Halloween for a reason. It's also on throughout the year, of course, because it's so good. But there was also that moment where all of a sudden they shift and the nursery door is open, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like,
and that spiral stairs that starts to shift. I've got vertigo. Anything like that, I just cringe. And every time that comes on, I've seen it dozens of times. Gets me every time. And oh God, not that stairway again.
And Johnson is so good as the PhD, like trying to investigate doorways into the unknown. When he narrates the whole trail into the movie, the Hill House was a house some would believe was born bad. You know, that whole, he just really sets the stage, and Weiss is smart enough to let him just eloquently do it. And I mean, you know, it's funny because like I forget that I look at that movie and I forget this is the same guy that directed West Side Story.
Yeah, no, exactly. You look at the two, you go like, how can that be? I mean, he just had, he liked to tell a good story, even though it's a musical. And one thing we can talk about, and we'll get to it in a moment, but it's his background as an editor.
Yeah.
He would go into a film and he knew exactly what he needed. And I know I've heard an AD talk about working with him, and he was just shocked on a master shot. They just flubbed totally. He said, okay, print, moving on. He knew what part of that master shot he was going to use. He didn't need the whole thing. He's going to go from the person coming into the room, sitting down, cut to the close-up. So if the close-up didn't, the dialogue didn't work in the long shot, well, I'm not going to use that anyway. So carrying that experience of an editor in. He was a very economical director and made life easy on the set. He wasn't, he didn't go in and say, we got to cover, and I've heard
Right.
stories. I remember Joel McRae saying he worked on a George Stevens film and he couldn't believe the number of setups on him just going out a door. He'd cover it from above, from the side, which was the way Stevens do it. He'd get all the footage and then make the film in the edit room. Where Robert Wise said, no, this is the film I want, and this is the way I'm going to shoot it. Very much like Hitchcock was like that too.
Hi there, everybody. Voice actor Roger Craig Smith here to talk to you about NMOSD. It can paralyze you, it can blind you, it can even kill you in a matter of minutes, but we are very close to a cure, and with that cure could come a cure for cancer. So please go to the Guthrie Jackson Foundation and donate today. Appreciate it.
I believe it was the great director Bruce Pittman who once said, "Keep it simple, stupid." I don't know if it was you, but it sounds like something I could hear you saying on a set when they tried to suggest additional set. I also think that Wise probably took the education as an editor for Wells and spun that into an education of how to deal with studios like RKO, because Wells was unceremoniously dismissed as like, we don't need we need showmanship over like your visionary talent or something. They had some message to
rather than genius.
Yeah.
It's interesting with Wise. He got his, he started at RKO as a editor, probably as an assistant editor first. And one of the early films he edited, and he was only like 25 when he did it, was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So he was one of their top editors. And when Citizen Kane came in, he edited that for Wells and was just, he admitted he was just stunned by the footage that was coming in. He just thought it was absolutely superb. And then right after that, they did the Magnificent Ambersons, and RKO had totally cooled toward Orson Welles because of the problems with Citizen Kane in terms of Hearst and all that fuss that came out about Hearst and, Hearst dropping advertising for RKO and all. And they said, we don't need this anymore. And when they got to Emerson's, and Wells had sort of gone off to South America while it was being edited to do a film down there. And RKO just came in, took over Magnificent Emerson's, and just basically cut 40 minutes, maybe even an hour out of the film and just put it on as a programmer. And Robert Wise was editing this film. And he said there came a point where he said, well, now the film doesn't work because you cut out this. And they said, here's new pages. Here, you go film this. So his first directing job was usurping Orson Welles on Magnificent Ambersons. And you've got that stupid ending where they're walking down the hall. It just all of a sudden you jump forward and Joseph Cotten and Agnes Moorehead are in love and they're walking down the hallway and everything's going to be fine. It just feels like it's tacked on. In fact, it was tacked on just to give it an ending and let's get away from this movie. And he felt terrible about it because he knew what a great film that was. And it's still considered one of the great films, even in spite of all that. But of course, a negative of all that footage is long gone. It'll never be put back together again. But that was his first job of directing, even though it was that little piece. And then he was working in the Val Lewton section of RKO, and Val Lewton he was a producer at that special section of great horror films he did. And he was working on Curse of the Cat People. And very early on, Lewton came to him and said, well, we just got rid of the director. Would you like to do it? And he said, well, I don't like taking over. And he said, look it, either you direct it or we'll get somebody else. But the guy that we hired will not be directing. So reluctantly, he took it on that basis and did The Curse of the Cat People, which is one of the great Val Lewton horror films, that thing, and then went on to do The Body Snatcher, which is another great Val Lewton horror.
Brilliant.
So And then through RKO, through the years, he did The Setup, one of the great boxing films with Robert Ryan. So he really earned his spurs at RKO, and they gave him a shot at directing, and he proved himself to be very good because he was efficient. He knew the shots I need to put together the film because he'd been an editor. And at that point, RKO loved him for that because there wasn't going to be this overage and extra costs and extra coverage. You just go and shoot what you need and put it together. We can get it out. And that's basically how Robert Wise got a very successful start to his career, working low budget.
Can you imagine having a career where in the trenches you're picking up all the educational bullet points from the likes of Orson Welles and Val Lewton?
Yeah.
That would be like you going to work today, be like, okay, Coppola and Spielberg are going to show you the ropes.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And Val Lewton was a guy who had to work under tremendous restraint because he wasn't given a budget. He had to kind of innovate, as we all know. Scorsese did a brilliant documentary on him, actually. And
yeah, that's
why,
a love documentary. Yeah,
isn't that great that he did that?
Yeah.
And it shows the ups and the depressions and the downs of being an artist. And you know, Lewton was a special talent, but Wise, I think, probably picked up a lot of this and knew moving forward, when I get my chance to direct, which he got, you go, this is where he could probably sense this is what the studio is going to be sensitive about. This is what they're really going to care about. This is what the office back on the base is going to care about versus where I am here. Yeah. They're not going to care. Like, did you get that sunset? Was the composition on your shot great? Wise, they're going to be like, why are you behind?
Yeah, no, exactly. No, he being an editor, he would know all the politics because the heads of the studio would be in the edit room hanging around, and then the director would be in there. So he really got an education about how to deal with studios, and then he'd get, I don't know whether he was, when he left RKO, whether he got approached by somebody else, but I think he was at Fox for a little while because he did the Desert Rats, and I think Executive Suite was MGM, but he did a series film. So I don't know whether he left early, became independent, and would hire himself out on a per film basis. Certainly that came up later on in his career, but through the 50s, I'm not exactly sure whether he was associated with one studio, whether he did it one film at a time.
Right. And speaking of the Desert Rats, it reminds me that I think James Mason is the only actor to ever play Rommel twice.
Yeah.
In two movies. He played him twice. I mean, a lot of great actors have played that role, but he played him twice. So when you meet a guy like Weiss, and you being as charismatic a talker as you are, and something of an intellectual when it comes to film work, what do you talk about with this guy? Where do you start the conversation?
Well, it's the way you walk in the room, you've got that moment of like, this is the guy that won 2 Oscars. He's done several of your favorite movies. So there's that little, they come in and jump into a subject area. And I think the first time I met him, I said, I want to talk about Citizen Kane and your editing job on that film. And that immediately twigged him, and we got right off on that. And then meanwhile, you're saying, no, it's just it's a professional talking about his job, and then you can move on from there. But it's always tough getting over that initial, oh my God, that's the guy who really did this stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like he was hired to do Star Trek The Motion Picture because it made Shatner validate the process. I figured like he's one of those actors or directors that everyone respected, even if maybe you didn't want to fully do the project or embrace the project or understood the project. He was like the guarantee. He was essentially what the bonding company did for the insurance aspect. Like, he walked in and you go, well, obviously this is going to be good on some level. I mean, the dude did Star, it's like, so
I had a funny experience. I think I was around, that was Paramount. I was around the studio at Paramount at the time, and I went in to do an interview, and Robert Weiss is doing that. I think we did a little short piece with Weiss, and they said, "Oh, you want to stick around and do an interview with?" Oh, my brain's gone. The guy created Star Trek,
Roddenberry.
Gene Roddenberry, and I went, "Oh my God," because I'm not a fan of science fiction because mostly I don't understand it, and I just don't like magical stuff happening to solve human problems and I know they're using it as metaphors and all that, but it's just something I'm not into it. And there's, Mr. Roddenberry's here, he'll sit down and like bang, came in the room and sat down. It was like, I think I got through the interview because he was a great talker and he liked to talk about this stuff. And I think I just said, tell me about the project. And then I could fill 10, 20 minutes and he just went straight on. But he was an interesting guy. But and I think Star Trek it's considered the least of the movies, the least best. I think it got bad reviews.
I mean, it got barraged with negativity when it came out. I mean, there's no denying that it's beautiful to look at. If you want to get into a pacing argument, which is interesting because Weiss was an editor once upon a time, and I've heard stories that Weiss didn't understand how it was going to work and the shooting process with the effects, but I feel like it's worth seeing, and it's big. It's a project. The visuals feel big, and I got to commend him on it. And honestly, depending on where you're at with your film sensibilities, it's a thought-provoking story. And this is coming from a non-Star Trek guy who has a lot of respect for Roddenberry, and you're right, he can keep a conversation interesting. But I also know Nicholas Meyer, who did Star Trek 2 and some writing and other direction for the franchise. But I look at Star Trek, the motion picture, and realize this is slow. But the idea that the Voyager probe gets sent out, sucked into like a black hole or a wormhole, ends up on the other side of the universe, sucked into a planet run and populated solely by machines who repurpose it and send it back to look for its creator who built it. When you think about that, you go, God, that's some pretty heavy-duty concept work. Yeah. But the dilemma is, how do you pace it to captivate audiences? Well, that's where science meets, the art meets the road, so to speak. But it's a movie I think everyone should see for whatever interpretations you can get out of it. But I think also, just to appreciate Wise, his choices in the film are unique in terms of what he captures and how he captures it. And I could see Wise probably having your dilemma on it, like where's the human element in all this? But also I can see him trying to run it down, like trying to find the human element and all that, being curious.
Oh yeah, I'm sure he did, because he was always, all his films have very good performances.
Yeah.
Without fail. I'm thinking back now in the 50s, he did Somebody Up There Likes Me, which wasn't Paul Newman's first film, but it was like, that's the film that Paul Newman really got noticed in. Like, this is a really good act, screen appeal, and that, and Susan Hayward and I Want to Live, the one that put a fairly big dent in executions in the United States at the time. Mm-hmm. But I think he liked more human dramas. I think he did Two for the Seesaw, which I'm not that familiar with, but again, very good performances that I've heard from that film.
Yeah, and there's also that side. He probably got the Star Trek job based on The Day the Earth Stood Still. I'm sure Roddenberry was a fan. What is it? Who was in the suit? Who was the guy that played his alien enforcer? Do you remember who that actor was? Probably Richard Keel or somebody.
I have a terrible admission to make. I've never seen the Star Trek, the TV show, and I've never seen a Star Trek movie. So you're talking to the wrong person.
No, that's okay though, man, because they're still there for you to enjoy. And now they're more easy to access than ever. So what else did Robert Wise have to discuss with you? Did you have any did you ask him? You probably asked him for some directing tips, knowing you.
No, I watched him on the set of Audrey Rose. Spent a day there. We got he came out for an interview in the break, and also I believe Marsha Mason was in that. We got her that day, and Anthony Hopkins came out and did an incredible interview about the essence of film acting. Uh, but I found his set was very quiet, which I always would love to have that. You rarely do. There's so much racket on a set that you really have to get the AD to like get everyone to work quietly. And he managed to do it. And I had the feeling that everybody in there knew who the director was and they listened to him. And he was in charge and did it very quietly, no yelling. It was just all very, very quietly and just went right along. And everyone had very good things to say about him in terms of people that had worked on a Robert Wise film.
You know, you mentioned Audrey Rose, and that's a movie that I would not on the surface picture him to have picked.
Yeah, it just sort of came and went as well. I mean, he had and I think his career sort of went on the rocks right after Sam Publicly did Star, which was a high budget Julianne.
Yeah, very expensive. Fox, I think.
And it bombed. And I don't think the Hindenburg did very well either.
Yeah.
With Ritchie Scott, and he had a very rocky career with that. I don't think he had any kind of runaway hits after Sound of Music and Sand Pebbles.
I'll tell you something about the Hindenburg. I actually just saw that. And I know from talking to production designer Joe Alves that when they went into production on Jaws, that Universal thought the Hindenburg was going to be the big movie that summer.
Yes, yes.
And so you watch these things and George C. Scott is captain. Have you seen the Hindenburg recently?
Yeah, I saw it about a year ago. Yeah, I pulled it out again, mostly just to look at, my brain's gone again. The guy who did the matte paintings for that, very famous guy. He did
Albert Whitlock.
Albert Whitlock. I mean, his work in that film is like jaw-dropping.
Yeah. I mean, my thinking with it is like, I don't know if that's how it happened, if the film follows like the historical, like, was that blown up or did it haven't?
That was one of the theories of like what happened to the Hindenburg. And I think the general feeling now is it was because they couldn't get the proper helium and they had flammable gas and there was the technical screw up. But for a lot of years and probably still around, people think, it was sabotaged, which is the view the movie takes.
Yeah, the movie says like some basically anti-Nazis essentially are gonna blow up the Reich's trophy to modern day aviation. Which, by the way, the Hindenburg strikes me as a complete death. Blimps in general strike me as a death trap. I've never looked at a blimp and be like, that's how I want to travel.
More than half the people on it survived.
Really?
You don't get out on an airplane. No, check it out. How many people actually got off of that when it crashed? Huh. Well, everyone's seen the photo of the fire and everything.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's more than half the people survived that crash.
And Led Zeppelin used it for an album cover.
Yeah.
But it's, again, Wise takes, he captures it in a very, very interesting way. I mean, you stick with that movie. I know what's going to happen at the end of it, but I stick with it.
You do, but it's still in the old fashioned.
Yes, I know what you're saying.
Slow. It's slow. It builds, and then there's this, and then there's this, and it beautifully done, but not at the pace that people want these days. So,
did you
speed up an airship?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is going to linger. Did you ever work or meet George C. Scott since he was in Hindenburg and we're talking about the film?
Interesting with George C. Scott. I ran into him. I'd worked with Bill Nunn, who I quite liked. And there was a short-lived series that was being shot in Vancouver, and I just dropped by the set to see Bill. And And he said, "Oh, it's cold. Let's go sit in the car." And we just sat in the car and had a conversation. And George C. Scott was also sitting in the car to get warm. But he was not part of our conversation. He just said, "George, do you mind if we join you?" And he's an old friend of mine. So we just carried on conversation. And the other time was, I think, about a year before his death. I flew on an airplane, and out of first class, George C. Scott just sort of walked out. And I don't know where he was going, but he was very feeble. Didn't even look like George C. Scott. He had deteriorated so much, nobody recognized him. And then when we got off the plane, he was in a wheelchair. He was coming here to do a film, which I think was one of his last films. But that's my entire scope of meeting George C. Scott, which was actually not meeting George C. Scott.
Well, I mean, yes, I guess technically you're correct, but sitting in a car with him, it's interesting that you're in the car with him and he doesn't join the conversation. I mean, the thing about George C. Scott is he cast such an ornery presence in everything he did that you almost feel he's unapproachable socially.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at like...
when you sort of meet him and it was a night shoot and it was raining.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was more or less miserable anyway and didn't want to talk. So
yeah, I mean, like from Taps to Patton to Scrooge, pick your movie, Firestarter. He was just, you looked at him, even when he tried to be like a sympathetic character, like in The Changeling, you still kind of got this impression like, I don't want to have lunch with that guy.
Yeah.
And he may have been the nicest guy on the planet. I don't know, but it just kind of cuts that image.
I just rewatched Anatomy of a Murder, which was, I believe his second film, and he got an Oscar nomination. He's phenomenal in that film.
Well, obviously, yeah, too. And of course, there's the Kubrick film that everyone loves, the anti-war masterpiece. But what's that one where he was a doctor, like in the 70s? Was that Doctors or
Hospital? He's fabulous in that.
Yeah. I mean, he had some grit to him. You know what I just watched last night? I don't know if you've seen it. On a side note, Across 110th Street. Have you seen that?
Long time ago. Yeah.
That's them.
We had an okay week.
I wouldn't wish. Let's go.
On the table.
Anybody you got driving a 68 caddy? It's 2 cops.
Give him $20.
Everybody back in here, 2 months. Hey, Tom, what the hell's going on? Hey. No, for God's sake!
Today, they took our bank in Harlem for over $300,000. What? We have to teach them our lesson.
He's a cutie, isn't he? Ain't he a cutie?
You want your brains all over that wall, brother?
Kill him, tell him. This kind of thing went on with Prohibition.
Look, the way I work gets results.
I swear, I didn't see anything.
I'm gonna blow the whistle on you, is that it?
You want my job, don't you?
Go back to 1940! Pull out the powder keg, blow up the whole community!
Wow. That's something that Bruce Pittman should rewatch and circle back around on. So circling back with Wise, you can recommend 3 films for a young film student who knows nothing about the man or his artistic sensibilities to watch. What are the 3 Wise films you suggest and why?
3 films. I would go with certainly the Sand Pebbles in terms of seeing a large scale movie that's just about human beings on this boat. I'd put that one in there. You have to include West Side Story. I mean, just a superb musical. And that is where you see the editor at work. And I'll digress for a moment. I mean, that was co-directed, and he shared the Oscar with Jerome Robbins, who was the choreographer and creator on Broadway of it. They came in to direct together, and Jerome Robbins was a perfectionist with the choreography. And they're shooting in New York. They've taken over an area that was going to be torn down, but they're in New York shooting, which is not cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mears brothers watched the budget go up and up and up. Robbins was rehearsing and rehearsing and rehearsing all the dance sequences to get it perfect. And eventually he said to Weiss, he's got to go. We've got to, this is ridiculous. And Weiss came in and they had Robbins' assistants carry on. And it was fairly acrimonious, but they basically fired Robbins and Weiss, then finished the film off. But with the dance sequence and that, the choreography is amazing. But the editing of those dance sequences, that's all Weiss. The way it's shot and the way it's edited. And that's what makes those so good. So I'd recommend that one. Although I think Spielberg did an amazing job remaking that film. I mean, his version is equally as good, I think. And the other one, I might pull out I Want to Live, just because it's gritty, very realistic, and again, the study of a crime where Susan Hayward's involved in it. They convict her. somebody was killed in the crime. She's convicted of murder and goes to the gas chamber. And it's really a incredible performance, which obviously Wise was in charge of, but it's just a harrowing experience watching that. It pulls no punches on it. Even the execution is done in excruciating detail. So I'd recommend that one, although there's so many of his films that are so good.
Yeah, I think your picks are in tune with what the curators at Turner Classic Movies would pick. They would probably say, I Want to Live or The Sand Pebbles, followed by Sound of Music. Or
that's the first time we've mentioned that film, by the way.
I know it's not one of my favorites, but I know the world loves it. And there's like a whole ritual that watches it and does a sing along at the Hollywood Bowl that my kid loves.
Well, I've got to tell you, I went to Salzburg and I've stayed in and around that area there, and have been all the places where they shot it, which are just fabulous. And I did work with Christopher Plummer on a film. And,
how was that?
Well, it was interesting because I'd heard the story from Wise. So Plummer sort of dismissed the whole thing. He kept referring to, while they were shooting, it's The Sound of Mucus. He had very little regard for doing the movie the part, although he did a very good job and, a real pro and do it. But it wasn't like Hamlet, right. And Plummer had done Hamlet, and a very good actor. But okay, I'm going to do this sort of fluffy musical and that. And Weiss went to him and said, "Look, if you got so little regard for this, tell you what, I'll give you $150,000 for the recording rights, your share."
And
yeah, sure, go ahead. So Plummer sold out, and I'm not sure the actual figure, but he sold Robert Weiss his share of the soundtrack album. which was the greatest selling album, period, of the 1960s. More than the Beatles, more than Elvis, more than anyone else. The Sound of Music soundtrack. So it was a bad deal made by Plummer.
Do you think Plummer tried to relitigate it later and say like, oh, wait a minute?
No.
So Plummer always struck me as the character he played in Battle of Britain, kind of like this demanding elitist. I don't know if he really was like that, but that character in Battle of Britain struck me as the prototype for Plummer in real life for some reason. I don't know why, but other people have had some very interesting stories about him.
He was just a real pro. We did a Kurt Vonnegut film, the Harrison Bergeron, and he came up. We had not a lot to talk about. He sort of had the character down. He said what he intended to do, which was in total agreement with how I saw it. Always on time, always knew his stuff, was perfect. And occasionally would come up and say, how be I do this? And not to throw off the setups or anything that we'd already arranged. He just put in something a little extra. And he'd go away between while they're set up, and he'd go away by himself over to a corner and just wait quietly. When you're ready, he'd come in and he would do it. You just went, he's a total pro. I had a funny story working with him, a bit embarrassing on my part, but he's basically watching the other character on monitors all the time and observing this guy who's taken over a control room, a TV control room. And I just wanted to get just a piece, and we were sort of lit for it. I said, just come over where the camera is, and that the camera is like the monitor, just come into a close-up. And so you're watching him on the TV. And I just need a little bit of stuff that I can cut to if we need it. I'm not sure we need it, but we're here. I think we will. Why don't we try it out? And he came up, and we just started rolling the film. There's no dialogue. He's just watching it. And we rolled for about 45 seconds, and he's looking at a monitor. And I said, cut. And he looked over at me and said, I wasn't finished. And well, I didn't know where it was going to end anyway. So I said, okay, take two. And he did have a finish for it that I ended up using. He had it in his mind. He just wanted to put a little exclamation point on his look at the monitor. And he was exactly right. And that's the kind of thing he would bring you. I thoroughly enjoy working with him. Am I good buddies with him? No. He was a total pro. He'd show up and do his job and move on to the next thing. Because I think in the last 5 years, when he was pushing 90, he was in one film after another. Now, I think that film that was it... the actor that got in trouble and they banished him, the Oscar winner.
We'll cut it while we try to figure out his name.
Yeah, anyway, and it was a film being done over in England. It was about the kidnapping of the J. Paul Getty's son.
Right.
And guy playing J. Paul Getty, and they'd film. He'd finish it, but the studio went like, "Oh God, we can't release this movie with this guy in it because he'd been, I think, accused of being with young boys or something."
That's right. There was some fallout about that, and they recast it, right, and reshot his sequences.
Yes, and that was Plummer. They called him on a Saturday and said, "We're in deep trouble here. Can you come over Monday?" And they came over, and in 10 days, he shot that whole part, everything. They reshot it with Plummer. And Plummer is amazing in it with like 2 days notice and cram it all into 10 days. And it's just Ridley Scott directed. And he does a hell of a job. But he would just, one film after another, picked up an Oscar, supporting actor Oscar along the way. But I mean, he liked to work, obviously.
What was the movie where he robs the bank dressed as Santa Claus? And Elliot Gould is the teller.
Yeah, that was shot in Toronto too. God, my brain is really
The
fried.
bank is literally in a shopping mall.
Yeah, it
and
was
he
shot
goes.
at the Eaton Center, which had just opened. Yes. Um,
He plays a terrible character, but it is funny that he knocks it off as Santa Claus, and Elliot Gould
we
does
did
his
okay
bit.
here because a lot of the films made up here that to get government subsidies and so forth, tax credits, there had to be one Canadian star in it. And it would be like Michael Ironside or Christopher Plummer or, a Canadian expatriate. They'd just call him up. So he made a lot of money coming up to Toronto to be the token Canadian in these movies.
Hey, man, whatever works for the deal. I'm nobody's judge. Get him in there. Get him in there if it gets you started.
Good actor, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Looking back at Wise and his rather amazing, that's funny, we did not talk about Sound of Music, and that is one that Turner Classic Movies would direct you to. They'd say, Sound of Music, Julie Andrews was a pro too, by the way, still is, I should say. She's still with us. Sound of Music, West Side Story, and they'd probably recommend The Sand Pebbles, which I would also recommend, although I do feel that you have to be prepared. It's not a quick movie. But
no, it's a neat. It's like put your feet up. You're going to be there for 3 hours, so get used to it.
I remember seeing it at the video store as a kid, and it was 2 cassette rentals.
Oh yeah,
but what's that?
A double cassette. Yeah, I remember those.
But I would say, and maybe Turner Classic Movies would too. I would say The Haunting. You should see The Haunting.
Yeah.
I mean, now the tricks in The Haunting have been used and reused. It won't strike you as revolutionary, but at the time when The Haunting came out, it was powerful. It's still like the ultimate Halloween film for me. It's just,
The Day the Earth Stood Still, again, it's science fiction, not my favorite, but that's gotten a lot of new viewers have discovered that, that's a film. And that was, I think, 51 in that era there.
Yeah, it was early on. But I would say, Sand Pebbles, Two Flags West, and The Haunting would be my 3. And maybe throw in for just a weird wild card approach to something in a different direction, Star Trek The Motion Picture. Watch him. I always try to recommend things that are so polar opposite from the rest of what you're recommending so you can see what people would interpret as range, I guess.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But it's funny because you think of all these Western directors, and Westerns done by John Ford. I can never see John Ford directing a sci-fi.
No.
But Wise pulls it off.
He does. I mean, he switched genres.
Yeah.
Ford, not so much.
No.
I mean, his films were always in a certain category. There were the Westerns and the war films, and The Quiet Man might be out of there, but you still get the feeling like, well, The Quiet Man's kind of like Rio Grande almost. It's like, the love affair between, Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne and that. And no, Ford stayed in an area he was comfortable in.
Do you think that The Quiet Man, which is one of my favorite films, do you think that started with the idea that, hey, man, we can all vacation in Ireland on the studio's dime?
Well, I'll tell you, I've been to Kong where they shot it. It's part of my worldwide film archaeology.
Very, very interesting.
I've been there a few times. And there's a hotel there, 5-star hotel. It wasn't at the time. It was the Guinness Summer Place, which is a huge mansion, Ashford Castle. And he stayed in, and everybody stayed in Ashford Castle. And I've obviously seen the movie a number of times. Where he first sees Maureen O'Hara and he's coming down the pathway, that's on the golf course. They just took the flags out and filmed, and it's green grass and all that. Ford rarely left the parking lot for that. It's a stunning thing. You think, oh my God, that's gorgeous. No, he just said, no, just point the camera there, and for the next part of their walk, we'll just go around the other side of the hotel. We'll film the walk across the front of the hotel. Well, of course, we'll be looking across the lake. but it's so confined, and it must have been a joy to work on because they could walk to all the locations from their hotel, walk out in the morning. There's a few that might have worn exteriors, of which there weren't that many because they rebuilt the house back in Hollywood, even for some of the exteriors. But yeah, I got a feeling that that was half it. Ford said, look, we've got a lovely script. Plus, we're going to have a great time in Ireland.
Well, he was known to say that, and it's a great horse racing scene in that film too. Not to mention one of the hallmark film fight scenes of all time. But Lee Marvin always tells that story where I got a phone call, and it's John Ford. He says, "Listen, we're going to Hawaii with Duke. We're going to shoot a film called Donovan's Reef. You're in it." And Marvin says, "Oh, great. Well, we'll send me the script." And John Ford says, "You don't need to see the fucking script, Lee. We're going to be in Hawaii with your friends." And that was it. So he said, "Okay, when do you want me there?" And he just showed up not having read and that does seem like a movie where nobody bothered to read the script. I hate to tell you, Donovan's Reef, but hey, see it for what it is.
Yeah.
But you recommended some good ones. I mean, Robert Wise is definitely was definitely a skilled filmmaker and a very nice man in my interpretation of having talked to him only briefly, but a skilled filmmaker. He did interesting stories and made interesting choices. Like you almost feel like he picked things that were, of course, interesting to him, but unique to him. Like he almost wanted to try it. Like, oh, I'm going to do Audrey Rose. Like that's like the last script you think would land on his desk, and he'd be like, "This is my next movie."
I think so. I think he'd go like, well, I haven't done that one before. That
right.
Interesting thing. Maybe I'll try that whole different genre and see what I can pull off there. I think he was very much like that.
Yeah, and he was, I think, Wise also in charge of the DGA at one time, if I remember right, back when I was a kid.
Yeah, I'm
who
sure.
Now, as always, with legend director Bruce Pittman, one of our favorites, who is riding high on the YouTube channel with some very, very high combat radio ratings right now, including his Sand Pebbles take, also very high, highly regarded by the audience. Now, who should we look at next? Who should be a fun director to?
Well, I just for my own joy, I put together, and it's 13 directors that are all sort of in the category of Wise, not in the pantheon, but should be. I mean, I had people like Curtiz, William Whitman, Rel Walsh, and another guy who I met and interviewed, Henry Hathaway, who has like an amazing number of films, all very solid entertainments. On nobody's list of great directors, but you watch those films, they're all beautifully told stories, very concise. So I've got a list of those directors that are just over there, and each of them did like 75 to 80 films in their career. I mean, they just worked all the time.
Yeah.
Generally, their films were very, very good.
I love the work of Curtiz, particularly like Captain Blood, Charge of the Light Brigade. Wellman, brilliant. I'm thinking Hathaway. Did he direct The Desert Fox?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. Hathaway's an interesting choice.
From the lives of the Bengal Lancers all the way up to True Grit, and I'm sure he worked beyond True Grit as well. But he had a long career, and of course, was known as the screamer, the man who would have tantrums and drive people crazy and fire everybody. He was maybe the Peckinpah of his day.
Peckinpah. Oh my God.
He'd been retired when I interviewed him. Sweetest guy you'd ever meet. He was just could have been nice. And then I heard stories afterwards of these tyrannical rages he'd have on set. And I couldn't see it with the guy I was talking to, but he'd retired, so maybe just chilled out a fair bit.
I remember you said that, and I was blown away by that. But we know that is sort of somewhat I wouldn't say stereotypical, but quite often you'll interview someone and he'll be fantastic and you'll see him in action. You'll be like, who is this fucking animal? You know, who is this guy?
Yeah. Well, Jack Cardiff he worked with him on Legends of the Lost, which actually one of my pleasures, that film. Because Jack Cardiff, any movie that he shot, I'll watch. Anyway, the photography. But he talked about Hathaway, but he said, yeah, Hathaway would get in a rage, but it was usually for a good reason. It's like people weren't doing the job they were hired to do. Get on with your job, and otherwise, get the fuck off my set. It was that kind of thing. And Cardiff said, I got along with him great because he got along great with people that knew what their job should be and did their job. And him and Cardiff got along great. And Cardiff said, yeah, half the time he was, he'd make a lot of noise and that, which wasn't necessary, but he generally was right in being angry at stuff.
Well, I'm going to go back in time and watch some Hathaway movies on your recommendation and probably take another look at like West Side Story or The Day the Earth Stood Still based on our conversation today with Wise. But what's fun about this is it does give us an opportunity to remind people how special a talent that guy was, actually. You know, it's funny because I don't think for the average person who's a film buff somewhere out in the world, Wise could be sitting next to you at a Denny's and you would never know he was this great director.
No, exactly. Very quiet, low-key guy. And it's interesting, and these conversations we've had about, these films that go way back when, it's interesting. I've talked to people that are interested in making films and want to make films, and they just don't know the history of where films came from. I keep telling people, there's nothing new anymore. Everything you see that's done has been done before. You should know your history.
Yeah.
I've talked to film students that don't know Apocalypse Now. Haven't seen it, never even heard of it. You go back to The Wild Bunch. What's that? Is that a motorcycle movie? I'm astounded with all the stuff that's available now, TCM and videos and that. People that want to get into film don't study the history of where it all came from. And you see people like, they say, well, Scorsese, great director. He's a film scholar. He knows more about the history of film than anyone around. Spielberg's the same. All the great directors know the history of their art. And it astounds me that young people now who want to get into film just don't dig in and find these things.
It's almost offensive, and you should be barred from working in our industry if you don't know The Wild Bunch and Apocalypse Now. For obvious reason, when you do see them.
Hey, just they're great films. You'll have a great time watching them.
Yeah, I remember so I saw, my wife actually made the news because she found the missing reels that reconstituted Peckinpah's cut of The Wild Bunch in a warehouse. But I saw The Wild Bunch as a kid, and I'm like, all right. But it wasn't until I was working in John Milius's office where he said, George Lucas came to Adam one day and said, you got to see The Wild Bunch. It's better than The Searchers, and he kind of, the way he told the story about George Lucas being enthusiastic about it, then Milius in turn being enthusiastic, made me think, well, I got to rewatch it. I remember putting it on, and right in the beginning, the first thing that kind of popped into my head was, I have never seen a guy fire off a pump action shotgun so fast in my life than when that guy takes out, like blows the windows out and goes like bam, 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 bam. And I'm sure there's an editing rhythm to it, but I remember seeing that going, and then when the body falls from the roof through the awning.
Yes.
And then the one guy's being dragged through the street, and I realized, like, wow. get why other filmmakers, great filmmakers, think this is a great movie. The way that movie unrolls and goes at it.
The style of that editing, I've never seen since. It was Lou Lombardo was the editor on that,
Right.
and Paz use of editing there and in Straw Dogs. It's not been used again. That sense that now it's just quick cuts. That wasn't quick cuts. He had a sense of it. Like you say, the guy starts to fall off the roof. They go over here, you another cut and another cut back. He's still falling. Cut to something else, cut something else, and then he hits the ground. And that sense of doing it. And Peckinpah went to Lombardo while they were shooting all this stuff. And Lombardo had never cut a feature. That was his first feature as an editor. But he liked the work that Lombardo had done on Police Squad.
M Squad? Was it M Squad?
M Squad. And he was cutting on it, and he liked the way when the action things he did. And he cut the first where the bounty hunters blow up the town and all that. And they just had a mountain of footage, and it was like 20 minutes long. And he said, keep cutting it down, but don't lose anything. Keep every shot, just shorten everything. I want to see everything we shot, but make it shorter, make it shorter, make it shorter. And then they went in and said, well, just mix it a bit, cut that and interplay it a bit. And that's the way they went through it. And it's amazing. And that's another one of my film archaeology. I went to Paris, Mexico, where they shot it. And
you told me.
Yeah, and the old winery for the conclusion was shot, the finale. Yeah, but that's you can learn from all this stuff, and it's readily available to learn and just study that stuff.
So that movie should not be missed by anyone, just for what it offers technique-wise. But that's one of those films where 20 guys ride into town, and 4 minutes later, there's 6 guys left or something like that. It's just like it just unloads, and I've never seen so many rapid-fire gunshots cut to guns blade in every direction, and it's like kapow. And I love Warren Oates. I came to love Warren Oates later in Blue Thunder because he based his role on my grandfather with the LAPD. So I have a big affection for Warren Oates, who sells it as like this white trash criminal.
Right. Yeah.
And by the way, he told a story that he and Sam Peckinpah racked up a $70,000 bar bill on Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, which would have been like $500,000 in today's money.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Leave it to those two guys. But Apocalypse Now 2 is another one of those movies that's just so interesting in its approach that film teachers should center a class around it.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. It's a stunning piece of work.
Yeah.
From many different directions. You can look at that film in many possible ways, and it's stunning. Yeah, I just watched it on the weekend, plus all the extras that they have with that, because they did the documentary, and then they've got recent interviews with John Milius, does an interview with Francis Ford Coppola, and they go through the whole evolution of the script. Marvelous interview. It's like an hour long.
Yeah, and those two guys are like two kids in a detention class. I met Coppola one Christmas in John's office, and it was hilarious. But John Milius told me once upon a time that Coppola didn't want him on the set because he was 100% convinced that if he gotten there, UA would have replaced him. Like, oh, there's a director there now that can get this under control. So that's the way John Milius tells the story, that he was barred from the set for the reason that Coppola feared like some sort of Shakespearean takeover. You know, it's a movie that you have to wonder about, because Steve Serchik and I were going, do you think you could hear music during a chopper attack? Probably not, but doesn't it work well in the movie? It's so awesome the way they put that whole thing together, the operatic approach to like, now we're going to burn down huts, to this great Wagner track. It's like the magnificence of it with the sheer destruction and like shock of it is kind of what one guy we should talk about that I have a lot of respect for is Kurosawa.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Maybe we circle back on him at some point because I do think that he was regarded by a lot of these guys, particularly Milius, Coppola, and Lucas, as being,
And Peckinpah.
yeah, yeah,
He looked at the Seven Samurai and said, "I can outdo that." But he
yeah,
modeled a lot of that, and yeah, no, Kurosawa. A lot of people learned from him.
yeah. And you can see his influence in like Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, but you can also, I mean, we know about the remakes, Magnificent Seven, Fistful of Dollars, but Gerald Akamura told me when he was working with Peckinpah on The Killer Elite that Peckinpah made them all watch Sinjuro,
All right, yeah.
which I love. I love the music to Sinjuro. I love the heart of Sinjuro, not just the action sequences, but just the idea that the samurai has to babysit these young samurai that he sees as stupid kids, that he's got to kind of like babysit. Uh,
It's funny. I mean, every director you talk to them, they all have stories about the films they went back to refer to before they started doing what they're doing. Like Orson Welles has said he watched Stagecoach 50 times before he did Citizen Kane. He just had such respect for Ford. And they're two, I mean, cinematically completely different in styles, but uh Wells just said, for instance, he watched a Stagecoach chase and he said, Ford, it's beautifully done. It's a classic. He said, the one thing I offer that, he broke the rules because he'll have the Indians going left to right. They'll do some close up shots of John Wayne shooting. The next shot, the Indians are going the other direction, and yet it works. So he said, I learned from that you can break rules. And of course, he hired Craig Tolan that said, well, no, you can't break every rule, Orson. You gotta have some sense of it. But it's directors will go and make reference films they've seen.
Two things about
I do that
Stagecoach.
all the time. I'll steal stuff. It's a good idea. It worked. I'll steal it. You make it your own, of course. Because I've got a different visual eye photographically, but in terms of setting up a scene, I'll go like, "No, let's try that. We can. Yeah, that was a good idea. Worked there. It seems we should try that."
Well, as William Friedkin told me at Warner Brothers once when I was talking about some moves in A French Connection, I was hoping to take inspiration from, he says, it's not stealing, it's an homage.
Yeah, that's it.
But two things come to mind with Stagecoach. One, Duke's entrance into that film, which was a mistake, is just beautiful, the way it comes together. And also,
I'm sure the focus puller on that dies every time they show it because it's bad focus pulling.
Yeah.
In focus, as the camera moves in, out of focus, and the focus puller just catches at the last second to put it back in focus.
Man, it's great to watch it. And then to your point of an earlier show we did together about Stagecoaches, the movie is so well directed that you don't think for a second, or maybe you do on your third or fourth viewing, that this Stagecoach isn't going 100 feet.
Right.
Not in that attack, because those horses are dead.
Yeah.
But you don't even think about that watching it. Just you're with the whole thing, but you realize, wait a minute, in reality, that thing isn't even going to be able to leave the Stagecoach stop.
Right. Yeah.
But it is a great movie. Another one everyone should see. I think it's an incredible film to look at.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's hundreds of films that people should.
Yeah.
It's you can go to any genre and there'll be at least 75 films in that one genre that are like required viewing. You should watch.
All of which we touched on today. Well, genius, legendary director Bruce Pittman is on a second pack of cigarettes, which tells me it's time to cut the maestro loose.
I'm almost out. That's it. We can't talk anymore.
Exactly. Someone's got to get to the store, kids. But it's always a privilege to see you. It's nice to kick off 2025. was such a fun conversationalist. And maybe when you got time, we can circle back on another choice or two that would be fun to look at.
Yeah, I'll do some thinking and send you a note, and maybe a couple of months we can do another session. I always enjoy it thoroughly.
Yeah, it's one of it's a special experience to hear you talk about some of these great filmmakers. And of course, it reminds us all to go back and check out your awesome work. All right, Bruce Pittman, good to see you, my man.
Good to see you.
Talk to you soon.
Okay.